Nothing in the climate solution space is more overhyped than green hydrogen. In the U.S., there's $7 billion in funding for regional clean hydrogen hubs and a production tax credit worth up to $3 a kilogram of hydrogen. But did you know that there's a battle underway on the definition of green hydrogen hidden deep in the tax code? On one side, we have companies who want to sell subsidized hydrogen of questionable greenness. I'll call this side the fast and dirty group. The other side wants the green hydrogen to actually be green. I call this group the slow and clean group. As you can probably guess, I'm firmly in the slow and clean group. Let's dig into the disagreement and why it's important. And spoiler alert, most of the news is good, but it's not too late for the fast and dirty group to pull ahead at the finish line. So let's start with a basic primer of the physics and chemistry of hydrogen. The hydrogen atom is by far the most common element in the universe, making up 75% of the mass of everything. In deep space, it's usually found as isolated atoms. But on Earth, highly reactive hydrogen finds something to combine with, like carbon to make methane. What it doesn't typically combine with is itself making molecular hydrogen from two hydrogen atoms. This is because molecular hydrogen is still very reactive, especially with oxygen making water, good old H2O. Molecular hydrogen is a very useful chemical for processes including making fertilizer and steel and processing crude oil. The vast majority of molecular hydrogen is made through the steam reforming process, where methane, also known as natural gas, is combined with steam and air to produce hydrogen and CO2. An alternative way to get hydrogen is to pass an electric current through water in a device called an electrolyzer, which cracks the water molecule into oxygen and hydrogen. The hydrogen is then collected for use. If the electricity comes from renewable sources, then this hydrogen is referred to as green, and no CO2 molecules were released in its manufacturer. This hydrogen can replace fossil fuels in some hard-to-decarbonize sectors like aviation, which I talked about in a previous episode. There are other ways to produce hydrogen, but for simplicity, I will just talk about these two. The federal subsidies do cover other methods that are low carbon, so if there's interest, I can cover that in a future episode. And here we get to something easy to say, but complex in the detail. If the electricity comes from renewable sources. If you build a fleet of floating wind turbines off the coast of Ireland and send the electricity to a central platform with an electrolyzer and hydrogen storage tanks, that would be green hydrogen. You could even add a battery system so the electrolyzer can keep running when the wind dies down. Alternatively, you could build an electrolyzer next to a natural gas power plant and use that electricity to generate hydrogen. This would be more expensive and more carbon intensive than just using steam reforming of methane, so it would make no sense. And this would not be green hydrogen. But if you could find some way to magically make it green and be eligible for the production tax credit, this hydrogen could be profitable. And you could sell it as green in spite of the fact that it might be the most carbon-intensive hydrogen on Earth. So what magical incantation would be required to turn the dirtiest hydrogen green? They're called Energy Attribute Certificates, or EACs. And here, as is often the case, the devil is in the details. On December 22, 2023, the Department of Treasury released the proposed tax rules on what can be considered green hydrogen for the purpose of the Clean Hydrogen Production Tax Credit established under the Inflation Reduction Act, which can be worth up to $3 per kilogram of hydrogen, which is more than the cost of producing hydrogen through steam reforming. Their proposed rules rely on three pillars: incrementality, deliverability, and temporal matching. To be considered green, the power source used to crack the water and make hydrogen must meet the requirements of all three pillars. Incrementality requires the source of power to be no more than 3 years old. In other words, we're adding a new load to the grid, so we need to add an equally large source of green power to balance it. Otherwise, carbon emissions will increase. Deliverability requires that the power source be close enough to the electrolyzer that the power can be transmitted to where it's needed. No point in having EACs from a wind farm in Iowa to power an electrolyzer in Los Angeles. And finally, temporal matching. This says that the power is generated in the same hour that it's used. Obviously, if your certificates come from a solar plant and you're running your electrolyzer at night, it's not being powered by the solar panels. This requirement is being delayed until 2027 to give everyone time to work out the bugs in the tracking system. The temporal matching requirements mean that electrolyzers are required to be intermittent rather than running 24/7. This will increase costs since the electrolyzer will produce less hydrogen per day for a given amount of capital equipment. The fast and dirty crowd aren't happy about this requirement since it makes it both technically and financially more difficult. My thinking is that's why they're getting the production tax credit. The proposed rules strike me as well thought out. They will slow the growth of the hydrogen industry, which I see as a feature, not a bug. Our electrical grid operators are dealing with the transition to renewable resources that are intermittent and therefore harder to manage. They're dealing with increased loads from EVs and heat pumps. If we deploy a vast fleet of electrolyzers that aren't temporal matching their energy source, the grid will be even harder to manage. The challenges of dealing with intermittent power sources should be a problem that hydrogen generation deals with from the beginning. If done correctly, hydrogen production can be a demand response element that prevents curtailment. When the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, there will always be a customer for their electricity. When the wind or solar production drop and there's a challenge balancing the grid, the last thing we want are electrolyzers adding to the problem. We need to remember that building a hydrogen industry is not our goal. Decarbonizing our society is. Growing an industry using the fast and dirty path will delay our effort to decarbonize our grid, which must be our first priority. It will make it harder to pick the low-hanging fruit of electrification if our grid is hit with an increased load that's unbalanced with new clean energy sources. If we make aviation fuel from hydrogen with a higher carbon content than traditional hydrogen, we've accomplished worse than nothing. I hope that the Department of Treasury rules become finalized without change and we follow the slow and clean path. But there are forces gathered putting pressure on the Department of Treasury to relax the rules and create an incantation to turn the dirty into clean. But remember, there is no true magic, only illusions. If you learned something, please like and subscribe. The like helps with the algorithm to know that this is a video to show other people, and it lets me know I should keep making them. If you want to support the channel financially, you can buy me a coffee. The link is below. And please share this video with anyone you know who thinks nothing good ever comes out of the tax code.